For the media, the more loaded the topic, the more the terminology matters. But there's still no agreement on when the press should use the term terrorism or, as in a recent standoff in Oregon makes abundantly clear. Adam has more.
These armed men have made it clear why they took over a national wildlife refuge in Oregon. They think the federal government's land policies are unjust. What's not clear is what we should call them.
A heavily armed militia.
Armed protesters.
Anti-government activists.
Then there are the terms the media didn't use, like insurgents or terrorists, which left Washington Post reporter Janelle Ross crying foul. If armed blacks or Muslims took over federal property and threatened violence, she argued, those labels would be ubiquitous. Instead,
we are talking about white Americans who are presumed to be innocent.
Also urging tougher terminology. WGBH News contributor Juliette Kayyem.
Terrorism is not just reserved to describe the violent actions of a certain religion. It is reserved to describe the violent actions or threatened use of violence by those who have a political purpose.
But others say, come on. Slate's Mike Pesca suggests we call the group behind the Oregon takeover nudniks, basically a bunch of dopes.
Somehow here I am feeling less than terrorized. There so far has been no violence. The buildings were empty to begin with.
Which, by the way, is a point that people occupying the wildlife refuge also make.
Terrorism is when somebody is put in extreme fear to control them. Who here has been put in extreme fear?
It's just the latest fight over what the word terrorist actually means, a debate that's also featured Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Dylan Roof, and the San Bernardino shooters. But for all that back and forth, there's no consensus in sight.
Adam, what do you call them?
Well,
nudniks.
I initially was thinking that I agreed with Mike Pesca and that, it's ridiculous to use the terrorist label here because these people are not, they're not actually shooting anyone. They're not trying to take lives. Then it occurred to me that if you happen to live around the wildlife refuge where this was happening, and you happen to know that a couple of these people have said, I'm here to die, or that they seem to have apocalyptic designs on what was going to occur, you would feel a little more spooked than I, sitting here in Boston, or Mike Pesca sitting wherever he sits, happens to feel. I don't think it makes sense to call them terrorists, but I think it makes sense to use language that is a bit more pejorative than simply say anti-government activists. And I would also say that, and this is not a media issue so much as it is a sociological issue, I absolutely understand why people would look at the response that, say, unarmed Black Lives Matter protesters have met with when they've met with violent force at the hands of law enforcement, and look at the sort of red carpet treatment that these guys have gotten from law enforcement and be enraged at the double standard. So very appropriate, I think, to talk about that, too, and ask why that's the case.
Yeah, I think the funniest response I saw to this was calling them Y'all-Qaeda.
Y'all-Qaeda.
That was definitely the most humorous approach there. I think I'm in favor of a strongly reduced use of the word terrorism on a lot of different fronts because I think it's not a very helpful term. I mean, we could look at the way that it's been Islamic terrorism is batted around in the Republican debates. I think that it does fit a fairly narrow set of circumstances. I think in this case, though, it is completely appropriate to say that if these were Black or Muslim people who were doing this, there's no doubt that the response of law enforcement would be very different. I don't think there's really any significant doubt there. I think it's a tough question, but I would probably go short of terrorist in what I would do. I don't think activist is the right term, though, either, because
that's
activist is so neutral and so implies that you could be an activist in favor of education or anything else.
So neither Josh or I have been able to actually give you the term we would use. We know we don't want to use.
I think militant is militant, and I think militia is a good term.
Militia, that's good.
The militia's good. The media may not have much memory, but I think the government officials trying to deal with this do have a long memory. And in fact, there was a very similar situation in Waco quite a few years ago in which the government acted in a very different way, and it ended up in a disaster with fire and deaths and everything else. So I don't necessarily blame the government for responding as cautiously as they have because they've been here before and they've seen that what they tried in the past didn't work. I kind of like nudnik. I would not call them terrorists unless they start to commit acts of terror, which they certainly have not done yet. In some ways, I think that this is kind of easy. I mean, we had this discussion a few weeks ago. You get a guy like Dylan Roof, who killed those African-American worshipers in South Carolina solely because of their race. that's terrorism. To me, this does not look like terrorism. It looks like something dangerous in some ways, but also kind of absurd.
I think the point here is that we're not supposed to look at it and determine that there is some definition. So let me begin by saying, if a security expert, Juliette Kayyem, says it's terrorism, I'm going with her definition. So that's the first thing. And as she has said in an extended interview, they are taking over a federal building. That's it, the end, period. Anybody else is routed out of there, might be shot at, whatever, and that's the end of it.
Weren't the buildings unoccupied, though?
Yeah,
It does not matter. As she has pointed out, they have taken over a federal building. And let me put it in the context that you have helpfully started, which is, let's put some Black Lives Matter people in an empty building with some, AK-47s or whatever the hell these people have, and tell me that the cops are going to stand outside and go, please come out, let's talk, let's walk. Well, you're upsetting your neighbors. Really? No. This is absolutely should be called terror. If you're going to call it other stuff terrorism, this is
It's up to the Justice Department to
terrorism.
actually figure out
That's
the label,
exactly
which is
right.
why the roof case and this is not.
And our
I'm going with them.
own WGBH security experts calls it terrorism. There you go.
Well, we can disagree.
can.
here.
I don't
We can
think
change
either
it
one of
too.
them
You
work.
can,
All
but
right.
you don't have a security
We can
background.
rant and rave
Just
about
pointed
this.
on it.